in terms of the structure, it might be quite similar to a classical public-private dialogue. Here, in the case of a competitiveness partnership initiative that we had initiated in Kenya, you had structured working group with, let's say, the beach tourism, convention tourism, safari tourism, and different action group that were below that. But this might actually belong to a higher structure which is located in the country to deal with competitiveness, a competitiveness committee that might deal with specific sectors. So we're going to find roughly similar type of principles in terms of setting up those partnerships. We talked about sectors that can take off through that way, but you know, those relationships, those structures, they tend to evolve more when we're talking about sectors and when we're talking about large, you know, at the country level, large partnerships who have a hard time to come about and eventually set themselves up at the political level, and then they tend to stay like that. At the sector level, you can have a lot of dynamism because the sector is really dynamic. And here's the case of the salmon export facility in Chile. And the anchorage of this particular partnership that helped the development of the sector has completely evolved over the time. And I want to show you the complexity of that. At the beginning, you know, you had the government, which was at the center. And it had cooperation with foreign government. And you had local producers. That was in the 60s, up till 1973. And that moved. Between 1974 and 1984, you started to have the local producer organizing themselves and bringing a different type of partners, including the industrial associations, the foreign firms, and, you know, really with a strong understanding of the market, but still dealing with the government. And then this was completely driven by the local producers with establishment of foundations that were now using a lot of foreign investments. And you see the complexity of the relationship evolving up till the period of the 90 to 95, when there were huge growth of the sectors, where you can see now a lot of different actors coming in and different kind of associations. Salmon Corp, which is being created to deal with a number of R&D in there, and it keeps growing. It keeps growing, and it keeps having now relationship with groups that are completely outside, in Canada, in the USA, with the WTO, and so on and so forth. And the local producers are driving, and government, which was a driver at the beginning, has taken the back seat, but still very much involved. Up till a competitive exporting sector structure, which has reached all the foundation of the society in terms of the different actors that are playing there. And so this kind of case illustrates how a sector competitiveness dialogue might completely evolve organically, depending on the evolution of the sector, the international partner, where are coming the investments, and all this. And they, of course, have to react. A system like this is kind of flexible because it has to react to market condition, and it also has to react to issues. For instance, in salmon, in Chile, they had a huge outbreak of specific illnesses that goes with the fish at some point, and that destroyed a lot of the stock and had caused quality problems. And to react to that and to institute better quality standards and to bounce back in this industry, they couldn't have done it with a structure which looks complicated like this on the slide, but which is actually the reality of the complexity on the ground. Now, when we consider those kind of structures, we have to kind of understand who participates and why they participate. And what I want to show you is the fact that there is a bit of an ecology of firms. And this ecology of firms is the fact that you have in every country, in every sector, you have the market creators. These are the key firms that are exporting goods and services outside the region, outside that country, outside that city. they're creating value, they're creating growth, because they're bringing more than what they're doing. And they're growing all the time, and they can create employment. And those ones are truly competitive firms that have made the best of all the different competitiveness factors that we talked about. They've made the best of the infrastructure, of the skills, of the R&D, of the access to finance, of the regulation, and they found a sweet spot in the market when they're producing those good and juicy mango, if they're in Haiti, for instance, and they're the one exporting. Okay, so you've got those big ones. And those big ones can be also, sometimes a big multinational, a Unilever that comes and wants to get some coffee from somewhere, or that wants to get some goods. And those companies in that country are part of that value chain, and they might be the second tier, the third tier supplier, sometimes the first tier supplier, and themselves, they're gonna use intermediator. They're gonna use firms that's gonna supply inputs, raw material, components, parts, specialized services to those top firms. And so when you look at sector competitiveness, you got to identify where those, what we call those anchor tenants are, where the anchor firms are that do export, and how can they grow down there. And below that, you have a network of SME that are supplying those intermediators. And so all this creates an ecosystem. And it's an ecosystem where at every point in time in that ecosystem, you're going to look at those market conditions and those competitiveness factors, and the competitiveness factor can impact that at different level. And sometimes you need to favor a little bit the top, so that they can bring the bottom up, and sometimes you need to favor the bottom so that they can build the top. Now, in order to do that, you need to put all those players together, because the ecology of firms is important to have all the different people together to understand what are the needs of the SME and what are the needs of the anchor firms and what are the needs of the intermediator. And you can't do something that's going to be solely driven at one, because it might actually be detrimental to the other. So we need to have everybody together. So how is it done? Here's an example in Malaysia with PEMUDA, which is the organization in Malaysia that takes care of competitiveness development and the betterment of the business environment. One of the things they do is they actually bring 1,000 movers and shakers together. I think it's about once a year. 200 or more than 200 multinationals, small, medium enterprise, government, ministries, they bring them in those huge auditoriums, and for a few days they exchange about how they can go about it. And from that, they set objectives, they transform it into a plan with transformational actions, they have targets of jobs, target of investments, and they realized that through this thing. So they were a deliberate state willingness to spur sector development through deliberate actions to bring in the different players, extract from them what are the sectors that works, what do we need to do for those sectors, but they did it in such a collaborative and structured manner that eventually it not just favor the existing tenants of the main private sector leaders, but it actually spread the wealth and helps bring different sectors about. Then they do this lab system, and from that, they have different rhythm of meetings. And here is, for instance, an example of what did they do in about 7 months, from moving from those big events to trying to derive more specific recommendations, and eventually come down to achieving quick wins as to what can we do to achieve those goals. And that goes from anything running from efficiency to policy, increase the number of e-payment facilities, new commercial courts, approval, streamlining approval for expatriates, issuance of ID cards. So those kind of things, although they're done for sector-specific reasons, they might have actually resonance for the entire economy as a whole. And this Malaysia case is quite interesting, because it shows how they did it from completely the state down, but eventually bring up a number of sector sector development. I go back to this industry collaborative action matrix. What you could do is you can look at it to look at what are the gaps, of course, right? So you could, here is something that was done in Jordan for the medical tourism industry level collaborative action, and this matrix has a number of the gaps that were identified along a number of factors. Of course, as you see, it's not exactly the same matrix, and because we're not saying that you need to use this matrix as is, but you can actually adapt it to whatever you're doing in the field. But thinking about those kind of categories is kind of useful. So they adapted it in the case of Jordan, and then what's interesting is you can play with that. You can say, well, if we identify gaps, are those gaps more important than others? And you can try to prioritize depending on how important the gaps are. And you can say, well, here is a grade we give to those, and how much we need to focus on this or that one, and what do we need to do exactly. Do we need to focus on this public-private action instead of another one? Do we need to focus on this private investment instead of another one? And so what we're arguing here is some kind of a methodology that needs to be homegrown to prioritize issues for the sector, but thinking about it very strategically, looking at export data, looking at firms' potential, looking at other sectors, similar sectors in other countries, looking at the marketing strategies that people can use. And so it's slightly different than purely the kind of filtering system that you might use in a statewide public-private sector dialogue, like those that I explained in a previous session on this video recording. But you have to consider really the export market you're targeting, and what can be done there, and who are the players, and who are the intermediaries, and who is bringing value, who is capturing value along the value chain. How can you maybe bypass those who are capturing a lot of the cost but not bringing a lot of value? And all those things needs to be considered, and those metrics I just showed you can be useful tools to do this, but every country needs to come up with its own system to do that. So, as a conclusion, public-private dialogue cannot really happen without applying the generic public-private dialogue principle, but it needs to be adapted to the industrial policy context, and of course to the sector stakeholders. You cannot do sector identification without sector dialogue. You cannot do a sector dialogue without a structured process. If you have a structured process, you can get good collaborative actions that can bring you sector competitiveness. And I hope that wherever you're listening to this video from, maybe those ideas will relate to what you've seen around you, where people around you are working, and all those factors, all this dialogue process. Try to think, is there a dialogue process behind that industry which is right next door? To which sector does it belong? And how can I improve it? And what can be my role in it? I hope this short video helped you consider some of those options, and will help you. So thank you.